Hi, I'm Ken Fisher. Welcome to the 18th season of CityWide. My guest on this edition of CityWide is Seth Pinsky. He's the former president of the New York City Economic Development Corporation, now an executive vice president at RXR Realty. Welcome to CityWide.
Thank you.
Actually, welcome back. You were kind enough to come on the show when you were at EDC. But just remind our viewers, what does the organization do? And then we'll talk about what you did while you were with the organization.
Sure. So EDC is an interesting creature that is relatively unique across the United States. It's the city's primary economic development agency, but it's a quasi-public, quasi-private entity. It's an independent not-for-profit, but the majority of the board is appointed by the mayor, and it coordinates very closely with city government, and its responsibilities range from managing a portfolio of properties, mostly industrial properties, to selling surplus city land. It does a significant amount of capital construction, about $2.5 billion capital construction budget, and also is involved in area-wide redevelopments and strategic planning for the city's underlying economy.
So why is that done through a quasi-public agency, a not-for-profit organization? Shouldn't just government be doing those things?
Well, again, it really is quasi-private in that it coordinates very closely with city government, and I think it would be inappropriate if what it did had no connection to city government. But because what it's trying to do is to build the city's economy, to generate tax revenues for the city, I think it's very important that it be able to straddle that line.
And be a little bit more entrepreneurial.
Exactly. Understand the business community, but also understand the public sector and the governmental processes, which are so important in achieving these goals.
So Mike Bloomberg was a mayor who was pretty focused on economic development. Wasn't entirely clear on the day that he took office, 2002, with the pile smoking in the background, that there was going to be any economic development. Give us an example of one big thing that you did at EDC that you think was really important, and then give us an example of a small thing you did at EDC that was important.
Well, there's so much that happened under Mayor Bloomberg that will really change the face of the city. And a lot of the things that get the most press are the high-profile, big development projects in Manhattan, things like the renegotiation of the World Trade Center deal that finally got that site moving, the Far West Side and the development of Hudson Yards, the extension of the 7 train. Really, the mayor's economic development agenda covered all 5 boroughs, from Willets Point and Hunters Point South in Queens to the Kingsbridge Armory in the Bronx to the Homeport and the new observation wheel and outlet mall in St. George, Coney Island in Brooklyn. I would say that, to me, what I think is one of the most exciting projects, though, is the mayor's applied sciences competition.
Tell us what the Genius School, tell us about that.
So the idea behind the applied sciences competition came from actually conversations that we had shortly after the collapse of Lehman Brothers. And at that point, we realized that there probably wasn't going to be a whole lot happening in the city, but that we needed to take some pretty dramatic actions. And so we spoke to everyone that we could think of, business leaders, entrepreneurs, academics, community groups, and we posed them one simple question. We said, if there were one thing about New York City's economy that you would change, that you think would have the most significant impact on the city, what would it be? And what we heard actually consistently was that although New York is one of the great centers of higher education, if you look around the world at the centers of innovation in the 21st century, what you see is a critical mass of applied sciences research and development and talent creation. And relative to the size of our economy here in New York, we just didn't have enough of it. So the idea was to go out to the academic community and to say to them, look, we as a city will offer you land, we'll offer you some capital to help you get a project started. What would you propose that you think would help us to solve this problem?
And the answer was a school.
The answer was actually several schools. At this point, there are actually 4 campuses that were announced under the Applied Sciences umbrella. There's a new facility that's being built by Carnegie Mellon at the Brooklyn Navy Yard to work on film and television special effects and computer-generated graphics. There is an expansion of Columbia University's engineering school that will increase the faculty there by something like 50% and start a new engineering institute. NYU, along with Carnegie Mellon and a number of other universities, is building a major new school that will be focused on data informatics in downtown Brooklyn. And then the largest project is a $2 billion new campus that's being built by Cornell University and the Technion, a major engineering school in Israel, that together with all these other schools will more than double the number of full-time graduate engineering students here in New York City.
Those schools didn't know they wanted to be in New York until they had to compete for the opportunity to be here. And then once Cornell and Technion were designated, the others had to be here also.
Well, you know, one of the tools that we used consistently under Mayor Bloomberg in the economic development world was competition. And clearly competition has a way of focusing people's energies. And when we went out and launched this competition, we knew that there would be some interest, but I think that everyone was really blown away by the level of interest and the ambition of the projects that not only were proposed, but actually are now moving forward.
So what about something small in the boroughs that doesn't have worldwide sex appeal?
Well, you know, a lot of the work that we at EDC did to try to make sure that we were preserving the industrial base here in the city, I think will have a very important long-term impact. For example, EDC made significant investments along the Sunset Park waterfront, modernizing the Brooklyn Army Terminal, creating new port facilities in the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal. And that, along with the work that the Brooklyn Navy Yard did, created thousands of jobs. And these are very important jobs for the city because they're jobs that employ people often without significant formal education at decent wages. And you know, we saw in the recent election that the issue of affordability is a big issue for New Yorkers, understandably. And if we want to make sure that our middle class and those who are not at the very upper echelons of education are able to live and live comfortably here in New York, this is a sector that's very important for our future.
So let me focus on that for a second. A couple of things I want to talk about. One is the waterfront itself. So the mayor, I've heard the mayor say that New York's value proposition is not cost, that there's always going to be a cheaper place to get something manufactured, but that its value proposition is its talent, and that the city needed to give people places to live, work, and play. Safe streets, an opportunity for education for the kids, but places for people to live, work, and play. And a lot of the new places for people to live, work, and play have been in former industrial areas like Greenpoint, Williamsburg, and other places around the city, where the consequence of that has been gentrification and, in some respects, the pricing out of the very manufacturing businesses that you're alluding to. So have there been unintended consequences for the strategy?
Well, look, I think that development is always something that's tricky to pull off, and it's very hard to predict exactly what impacts development will have on surrounding areas. That being said, when Mayor Bloomberg came into office, he looked at our 500+ miles of shoreline and saw that there were significant areas that had been reserved for a particular use, in this case, manufacturing and industrial uses, that had lay fallow for decades. I mean, we're not talking about a few years here. In many cases, it was decades. And often those areas were close to transportation. And there's clearly a need not just for industrial development, but also for residential development and commercial development. And so the mayor, looking at those 500 miles of coastline, said that we have the opportunity in some areas to repurpose those areas for other uses that also are very important for the future of our city. And those uses, by the way, also include open space. There's been very significant investment in public open space along the waterfront. And in other places, it meant investing in commercial enterprises, including industrial enterprises. And I think the mayor's belief was, and I think this is correct, that our waterfront is big enough to be able to accommodate all of this. And so that really was the goal of the Bloomberg administration's approach to waterfront development, to find a way to activate the areas that had been inactive for a long time, but also to make sure that we're preserving space for job-creating uses, which are so important for the future economic health of the city.
Often when you were advocating for projects, for Willets Point, for Coney Island, and others around the city, you, the administration, would use the phrase transformational. For a lot of the folks who lived in those areas, transformation to them meant somebody else benefiting, that being priced out of their neighborhoods, squeezed out of their neighborhoods, but also disconnected from the decision-making process. And Seth, you know, I know the public hearing process, and I know what the elected officials do, but there was a sense almost in every neighborhood of the city that things were changing and that people felt disconnected from the decision-making process. Is that an accurate assessment? And is there anything that could be done differently if you were going to do transformation in another neighborhood?
It's always possible to improve on any process. There's no question about that. I think that transformation in a dense urban environment is always going to be difficult, no matter what kind of process you put in place. There are always going to be people who are going to feel like winners and people who are going to feel like losers. One of the advantages, by the way, of the administration's focus on a lot of areas that had been very lightly developed or had been abandoned for many years.
People didn't live there.
You had the opportunity to make changes without displacing people. A lot of that land has now been placed back into service, which means that increasingly, if we're looking to make transformations in the city, and by the way, the new administration talks about transformations like 200,000 new units of affordable housing, that may end up involving displacement. And I think what we as a city need to focus on, which is something that we in the Bloomberg administration were always very focused on and always very conscious of, is making sure that as we're building the city for the larger good, that we're also focusing on the needs of the immediate area and the people who were in these areas before. And what I would say is that it's not just the public process that people see, the uniform land use review process, for example, that we go through in the city for rezonings, but there's also an enormous amount of consultation that takes place with community groups, with members of these communities, and most of these large development ideas that were advanced during the Bloomberg administration came out in one form or another from those kinds of very grassroots discussions. I mean, that was the case with Willets Point, which came out of discussions with the Flushing community. That was the case surely with Seward Park, which was a development, an area of the city that had been stuck in neutral for decades.
Lower East Side.
All of this was because of not just the formal process, but a lot of the informal behind-the-scenes work that took place as well.
CityWide will continue right after this. We're going to talk a little bit about what you're doing now and also what you think the new administration should be doing starting next year. Welcome back to CityWide. We're speaking with Seth Pinsky, Executive Vice President at RXR Realty. Seth, I'm sure over the next few years, if not the next decades, people will be analyzing the Bloomberg legacy. I'm sure you'll be asked many different questions, not just about your own role in it, but how you saw things. But I'm going to ask you one that I don't think anybody else will. Because you were there 2003, almost to the end. So I've heard various deputy mayors over the years talk about the fact that New York is a global city needed to have modern office buildings with modern facilities in neighborhoods to be able to compete on an international scale. But when Dan Doctoroff, Mike Bloomberg's first deputy mayor for economic development, was talking about it, he was talking about the far west side to the Hudson River. And then he left and Bob Lieber became the deputy mayor, and all of a sudden we are focused around the area around Penn Station and Midtown West. And then he left and Bob Steele became the deputy mayor for economic development, and all of a sudden he says it's got to be in Midtown East near Grand Central. So we all agree we need those kinds of buildings, but where are they supposed to go?
The answer is that we need them everywhere. You know, New York is very lucky in that it has something like 400 million square feet of office space. But if you look at when much of it was built, what you'll notice is that a very significant portion was built in the 1950s and 1960s. And over time, portions of that are being updated through investments, but also portions of it are becoming more and more inappropriate for modern uses. And what we need to do in order to stay competitive is to make sure that we are creating the kinds of office spaces that international companies and modern companies of all kinds need in order to be productive. And that means not just building new buildings in new commercial areas. And by the way, it's not just the West Side, it's not just Lower Manhattan around the World Trade Center, it's also in the boroughs. And this was something that also was very important, the idea of diversifying the business districts all around the 5 boroughs. But it also means looking at some of the areas that today are considered prime real estate and that are the heart of our commercial, our current commercial districts, areas like Midtown East, and making sure that we're not just freezing them in time. We as a city can't afford to be Paris, as wonderful a city as Paris is. We can't be a museum city. We have to be a city that's continually evolving if we want to remain a center of global business into the 21st century.
So getting back to affordability, which you raised before, EDC, not the primary mission to do affordable housing, but certainly a component of the residential projects that you were involved with. Can New York build its way out of the price squeeze? And isn't it true that unlike normal Adam Smith supply and demand, that when it comes to real estate, supply creates demand? That every neighborhood that you went in and rebuilt, or that the result was a bigger squeeze on the people who were left behind. How do you deal with the fact that a neighborhood that may have had burned out buildings 20 years ago, there are no more burned out buildings, but the people who live in that neighborhood can't afford to go into the new apartments?
So affordability is clearly an issue. I think first, though, before addressing how you deal with the question of affordability, I think it's important to remember that in many ways affordability is a symptom of the success of the city. The reason why...
Easy to say that to somebody, you know, who's not looking for an apartment.
And by the way, this is not to say that you don't need to try to address the issue, but it's important to understand why we have an affordability issue. The reason we have an affordability issue here in New York is because we are such an attractive place that more people want to live here than we're able to accommodate. That in fact, the last time New York really was an affordable place was at a time when we were such an unattractive place that nobody wanted to live here and our population plummeted by 1 million people. So I think that's just important to remember in terms of creating a context for addressing this. All that being said, it's very important for us, I think, as a city to make sure that we're maintaining our middle class, that we're maintaining our workforce. And to do that, we have to address the issue of affordability. One way that we do that is through affordable housing programs. And I think traditionally in New York, that has been the primary way that we've addressed the issue of affordability. Under Mayor Bloomberg, the city is creating or preserving 165,000 units of affordable housing. But the answer to your question of whether or not it's possible to address this problem solely on that side of the equation, I think the answer is no. And I think it's very important for us as a city to make sure that when we address the issue of affordability, we remember that there are 2 sides to the equation. There's a cost side, housing prices are rising, but there's also a mean side. That is that incomes for some people are not increasing fast enough to allow them to cover those costs. And one of the things that I think we as a city need to make sure that we're doing is working to attract the kinds of industries that employ people who don't have fancy degrees, who don't have a lot of formal educational training, at wages that allow them to afford to live in the city. And unless we're addressing it from both sides, I think that it's going to be very difficult for us ever to catch up to this problem as long as we remain a popular destination for people from around the world.
So should the minimum wage in New York State go up? And should the city require people who buy city property, who do deals with EDC, should the city require the retail tenants in those buildings to pay a living wage, and should they require the people who build those buildings to pay prevailing wage?
So now I'm speaking as myself personally. I actually think that the minimum wage is a more effective way to try to address this, because you're going to reach a broader array of people than if you just target those projects that happen to be getting city benefits. And actually, Mayor Bloomberg was a proponent of raising the minimum wage. I think that the more local the rise in the minimum wage, the more challenging it becomes, because it's easier for businesses to move across a border and to avoid the rise in minimum wage that way. So I think optimally you would see it happening nationally. In this political environment, that's probably not likely. So at a state level, it's certainly something that I think we should be considering. With respect to using economic development benefits to try to encourage higher wages, look, it's certainly a strategy that people could adopt. I think that the challenge that you face is twofold. One is that in requiring certain projects to pay certain wages that are different from the projects across the street, you're creating competitive dynamics that make development very challenging. It's not necessarily impossible to overcome that, but it's very difficult, and that's something that we saw with the Kingsbridge Armory in the Bronx.
Also may make it harder for the city to capture the value of the real estate that it's disposing of.
Absolutely, and I think that's an important second point, which is that if you're asking developers to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do, that impair the value of their development, even if it's for an important social good, there's a cost to that. And so if we're paying X dollars to get a project off the ground because that's what's needed to move that project forward, and then we ask a developer to do something else, then instead of giving them X dollars in benefits, we may need to give them 2X dollars in benefits. And there's a lot of criticism whenever the city makes investments in projects. So I think we as a city need to understand that if we're going to ask those kinds of things of the development community and we want to see development happen, that there's going to be a cost to the taxpayers of doing that.
So you spent almost a decade on the inside looking out. You're now on the outside looking around. What is RXR Realty, and what do you do when you get to the office in the morning?
Sure. So RXR is a major owner and developer of property around the New York region. The company today has interest in about 20 million square feet, about half of that in suburban markets around the region and another half here in Manhattan. I was brought to RXR by Scott Reckler and his team to launch a new investment platform that's focused on what we're referring to as emerging markets. These are areas around the region, whether they're in the boroughs or in the suburbs, that have suffered from underinvestment for a substantial period of time, but we believe have good underlying fundamentals. And the idea behind this platform is to go in to make investments and to try to redevelop these areas, not just to bring new people in, but to make them better places for the people who already live there today.
So one of the things that you got stuck with by the mayor, maybe you thought it was an opportunity, was leading the city's response and recovery to Hurricane Sandy. That must have been an extraordinary experience, not just the immediate aftermath, but planning for the future. So as a waterfront city, are there things that we should be thinking about? And if you had one piece of advice to give to Bill de Blasio, what would that be?
Well, with respect to the mayor's special initiative for rebuilding and resiliency, it was clearly a huge honor that the mayor put his trust in me to help shepherd that initiative forward. And what I learned from that is that as terrible a tragedy as Hurricane Sandy was, it was also a highly idiosyncratic event that involved the confluence of all sorts of factors that are unlikely to come together in exactly the same way in the future. And so if all that we take from Hurricane Sandy is that we need to prepare for the next Hurricane Sandy, then we really haven't learned the right lesson. But the important lesson to take from Hurricane Sandy is that it's a harbinger of a kind of threat that we've always been vulnerable to, but that we are likely to become more vulnerable to going forward with the impacts of climate change. And that we as a city, if we want to catch up to those challenges, if we want to make sure that we're more resilient, and we're never going to climate change proof our city, by the way, but if we want to make sure that we're more resilient, which means that we're able to resist more, and when our defenses get overwhelmed, which they will from time to time, we're able to bounce back more quickly. If we want to do that, we have to start investing today. And that investment is going to be substantial. And the longer we wait, the farther behind we're going to get. And so in terms of a word of advice for the next mayor, at least on this subject, what I would say is that we really don't have the luxury of waiting. And that we have to make sure that we're thinking about this comprehensively, and we're thinking about this ambitiously, and we have to start now.
My thanks to Seth Pinsky, former president of the New York City Economic Development Corporation. He's now executive vice president at RXR Realty. I'm Ken Fisher. Thanks for joining us on this edition of CityWide. Send your comments and suggestions to CityWide at CUNY-TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or contact us at cuny.tv.